Hello, I'm Laura Anderson. I'm OSCR's Head of Professional Advice and Intelligence. In this webinar today, we're going to look at external scrutiny, which is a key part of accounts. Our agenda for today then. First of all, we're going to start with a recap on the basics about charity accounts, which takes us right back to the material that we covered in the first webinar in this series. After that, we're going to start to look specifically at what external scrutiny actually is and the different forms it can take. We're then going to move on to look at who actually carries out the external scrutiny, and then I'm going to cover a bit more detail about the two forms of scrutiny, that is independent examination and audit. We'll then go on to look at reporting to OSCR, which is what we refer to when we talk about independent examiners and auditors reporting specifically to OSCR. And then we'll round off with where you can find more information. So I'll recap just on the basics again. Every Scottish charity has to prepare and file accounts with OSCR each year. The accounts have to be filed with us within 9 months of the charity's year end. That means if your year end date is the 31st of March, your accounts have to be filed with us by the 31st of December. You file your accounts using our online portal, which is called OSCR Online, and you file your accounts alongside your annual return. The two come to us at the same time. There are two different types of accounts that charities in Scotland can prepare: accrued accounts and receipts and payments accounts. We covered these two forms of accounts in some detail in webinars 2 and 3. If you want to look back at the accounts that are specific for your charity, you can find those on our YouTube channel. And every set of accounts in Scotland has to have some form of external scrutiny carried out, and that's a really important point to remember for today's webinar. So, what actually is external scrutiny? What do we mean by that term? Really, it's a process that involves somebody who's independent of your charity and independent of the record keeping for your charity, who looks at the charity's books and records, primarily the accounting records, and they look at the draft accounts and they do a comparison between the two. The person is essentially trying to make sure that your accounts are a proper representation of your accounting records, and they sign a report at the end of their checks that will give any reader of your accounts some comfort and assurance that someone who's independent of your charity has looked at your accounting records and is giving a statement that says that your accounts are a fair reflection of those accounting records. It provides comfort and assurance to a reader that they can rely on your accounts being an accurate and true position of what your charity's finances have been like during the year. There are two different forms of external scrutiny. There's independent examination and audit. Here on the slide, we're also going to cover who or which type of charity, is actually eligible to carry out independent examination and which charities have to have an audit. Independent examination is the one we're going to cover first. Independent examination is permitted where the income of the charity is less than £500,000, and that means that the vast majority of charities in Scotland are eligible to have an independent examination. If your charity prepares accrued accounts and its assets, that's its balance sheet assets, are £3.26 million or more, then you're still allowed, I beg your pardon. If you're doing accrued accounts and your assets are less than 3.26 million, again, you're eligible to have an independent examination on your accounts. Remember also to check the requirements of your charity's governing document. Many governing documents will be silent on any requirements to do with your accounts, but sometimes you might find that there's a requirement for audit in your governing document. And if that is there, then it doesn't matter what level of income or what level of assets you have, your charity has to have an audit. If your income is really quite small and you do have an audit requirement in your governing document, you can consider whether it would be appropriate for your charity to make a change to your governing document if you have the power to do so. You can find more information about this process on our website. The second form of external scrutiny is audit. Audit is required where the income of the charity is £500,000 or more. Similarly, if you've prepared accrued accounts and your charity's assets are £3.26 million or more, then you must have an audit. That threshold of 3.26 million applies to just the assets of the charity. You don't take away the liabilities to work out whether your charity has met that threshold or not. It's purely about the assets. Again, if your governing document requires an audit, then you have to have an audit. But of course, you could maybe change that if you have the power to change your governing document. And as I said, there's more information about that on our website. Sometimes charity trustees will actually choose for the charity to have an audit, even though it might not have an income of £500,000 or more. This can sometimes be because a funder has required an audit of the charity. If you're in any doubt, check in with your funder, particularly if it's a big funder of your charity, to make sure that if your charity is eligible to have independent examination, your funder's happy with that as well. Next, it's important to understand who actually carries out the external scrutiny job. Audit, firstly, is always carried out by a registered auditor. If you want to find a registered auditor in your area, there is a website that you can visit, which is www.auditregister.org.uk. This has details of individuals who act as registered auditors and audit firms right across the UK. For independent examination, there are two different situations. If receipts and payments accounts have been prepared, then the independent examiner, that's the person who's carrying out that external scrutiny role, they need to be able to have the appropriate knowledge and skills to deal with your charity's accounts, but they don't necessarily have to be a professionally qualified accountant. When we talk about someone having appropriate knowledge and skills to do an independent examination of receipts and payments accounts, it really means that they need to be able to understand what a set of accounting records look like, what a set of charity accounts should look like, and what the relationship between those two things are. We'll cover that in a bit more detail later on. If your charity has prepared accrued accounts, your independent examiner does need to be a professionally qualified accountant. There are a number of professional accountancy bodies which are listed in law, which your examiner in this situation would need to be a member of. More details of those professional bodies can be found in our guidance, and I'll talk about the specific guidance that you could refer to later on. So let's start to look in a wee bit more detail about the actual processes themselves. Firstly, we're going to look at independent examination because that's what the majority of charities in Scotland are eligible to have for their accounts. The first thing to bear in mind is that charity trustees need to appoint a suitable person for that task. It's their role and their job to appoint someone who's right for that job. They need to think about, first of all, independence. A key point about external scrutiny is that the person doing the scrutiny needs to be really independent of your charity. They can't be a charity trustee. They can't be a person who's related to a charity trustee, for instance. They can't be a member of charity's staff. They need to be someone who's completely independent of the way that the charity runs and particularly the way its accounting records are kept. It's important for the charity trustees to appoint someone who has the right skills and knowledge to do the job as well. As we saw earlier, the really key point here is that the person needs to be able to understand a set of accounting records, a set of charity accounts, and what the relationship is between the accounting records and the charity accounts. Because what the person's really tasked with doing is making sure that the accounts are a good, fair reflection of the charity's accounting records. We've got specific guidance for charity trustees about independent examination. And if trustees are new to this process or perhaps struggling to know where to start with appointing an examiner, this is a really good piece of guidance. Second thing I would say is that it is okay to use the charity's funds to pay a reasonable charge for your independent examination. Some charity trustees often worry that this isn't something that they should be paying for, but this is a legitimate expense for the charity. It's something that is required by law, and so it's quite fine for the charity, to use its funds to pay a reasonable fee. What a reasonable fee is will depend on the amount of work that the independent examiner has to carry out. So for example, if your charity is reasonably large and it maybe has quite a lot of different activities, then that perhaps is going to cost more than a charity which is very small and maybe just has one activity, because the accounting records will be a lot simpler in the second situation than they might have been in the first. The independent examiner is going to need to have access to the charity's books and records, and they may also have questions for the charity trustees and any member of staff that the charity has. The independent examiner needs to be able to have access to all the information, and this will include not just accounting records, but they'll also perhaps want to see minutes of your trustee meetings during the year and any papers that might have been presented to those trustee meetings. It's important for the independent examiner to get a really good idea about what's happened within your charity during the year, how it's operated, so that they can be sure that your accounts are a good reflection of what's actually happened in the year. So the independent examiner will do a review of the charity's books and records. So remember, that's the accounting records and any other records that they might think are relevant. And they'll look at the accounts and see if the two are comparable. They'll see if the accounts are a good, honest reflection of what's happened in the year. At the end of their work, the independent examiner has to produce a report which explains what they've done and the conclusions that they've come to. The content of that report is actually prescribed by law, and we have example independent examiners' reports in our guidance that I'll talk about right at the end of our webinar. The independent examiner might also have some recommendations or observations in the course of their work that they will report to the charity trustees. And this can be really helpful for the charity trustees in understanding perhaps where they need to improve on their record keeping or their internal controls. Your independent examiner should actually be considered to be a really valuable source of information to help you make good, strong improvements in how you run your charity. They are not your enemy by any stretch of the imagination. They are there to help and support you. Next, we're going to look in more detail at the audit process. Again, charity trustees must make sure that they appoint a suitable person for this task. And very often when you're trying to appoint someone to do an audit, you will do this through an accountancy firm. Again, we talked earlier about how you can find a registered auditor. If you're having issues with this, look at the Audit Register website. That's www.auditregister.org.uk. You can search by location and you can search by individuals or firms on that website. You should be able to find a registered auditor if you're having any issues through that website. Again, it's perfectly legitimate to use the charity's funds to pay a fee for your audit work to be carried out. If your charity requires to have an audit, that is a requirement by law, so there's no question about whether you can use the funds or not. Similar to independent examination, the auditor will need to have access to the books and records that the charity has. That's not just the accounting records. Again, they might want to see minutes of trustee meetings, and they might want to see papers that were presented to the trustees. If your auditor is new to their role with your charity, you'll also need to make sure that you're able to provide them with a copy of the charity's governing document. It's important for the auditor to be able to understand how your charity should be running and what the purposes of your organisation is. That's a really key thing for them to understand in carrying out their job. It's also worthwhile saying that audit is a slightly more rigorous form of external scrutiny compared to independent examination. So the audit process can sometimes take a little bit longer than an independent examination would. In a bit more detail then, the audit process involves an auditor carrying out some tests on particular transactions that the charity has entered into during the year. And they do that to make sure that those transactions have been properly treated in the charity's accounting records and to ensure that they will be properly presented in the charity's accounts. Audit work will not involve an auditor looking at every single transaction that your charity has had in the year. the auditor will focus very much on what they call material transactions. That really means transactions and assets or liabilities in your accounts that are particularly significant. An audit report again will be prepared at the end of the process to explain what the processes that the auditor has gone through and what their conclusions are. Again, the content of that report is prescribed by law. And the auditor may also prepare a report for the charity trustees to help inform them of where improvements could be made. Again, don't think of your auditor as your enemy. They are there to provide a service that is important and is required by law. They're there to provide that for your charity, and they're there to help you identify where else you could help improve the governance and the internal controls within your charity. So work with them and cooperate. Next, I'm going to cover reporting to OSCR. It's important for charity trustees to understand that auditors and independent examiners have legal duties to report to OSCR in certain situations. If an auditor or an independent examiner identifies a particular important issue in the course of their audit or their independent examination work, they have a duty to report that to us. They do not have an option to do so. If this happens in your charity and you become aware of it, don't be cross or angry with your auditor or independent examiner. They are simply fulfilling a duty that they have in law. It's not something that they have an option to do. We have specific guidance on our website that helps you to understand where that duty steps in, to help you understand what situations or what issues might arise that an auditor or an independent examiner actually has to report to us. In other situations, auditors and independent examiners can choose to make a report to OSCR as well. This might not be where the issue is particularly material or significant, but where they think that there's an issue that OSCR needs to be aware of to allow OSCR to carry out its regulatory functions. So let's think about where you can find more information on this topic. First of all, anything about the basics of charity accounts, refer to our guide to charity accounts. That provides a good overview of all the rules about the preparation of accounts and external scrutiny. It's absolutely the best place to start. As I mentioned earlier, we have specific guidance about independent examination, and this guidance is split into two publications. The first one is designed specifically for charity trustees, and that will help trustees to make sure that they're appointing a suitable person and to help them understand what the process actually might look and feel like for them personally. Secondly, we have independent examination guidance, which is specifically written for independent examiners. It helps them to understand the role and the job that they've actually got ahead of them, and also critically, right at the back of that guidance document, it has example independent examiners reports to make sure that they're getting their reporting right. When auditors and independent examiners have a duty to report to OSCR when they identify a material matter or a relevant matter, again, we have specific guidance on both of these situations, and you can find those on our website as well. So, rounding off then, you can keep up to date with everything that's going on at OSCR via our website. The web address is shown in the middle there, www.oscar.org.uk. If you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, that's OSCR Reporter, you can do so via the homepage on our website. You'll find right at the bottom of that web page a small link to our newsletter. If you click on that, that will allow you to sign up, and then you'll get regular updates. Please also look out for future webinars that we do on accounts topics and also other topics. And if there are things that you'd like us to consider doing a webinar on, then please drop us a note at info@oscar.org.uk. We'd really love to hear your ideas and suggestions. Thank you very much.